Hello, it's Dmitry again. Today we'll be going back to the Alexander Romance. Again, we're reading from the medieval French Alexander Romance, particularly regarding the episode of the Sun Tree and the Moon Tree. This is again another very famous episode in the Alexander Romance. It's actually preserved in the very earliest forms of the Alexander Romance that you can find in the Armenian version thereof. And so this was very limited in the original episode you would find in the Armenian tradition. However, you can find a much more elaborate or elongated tradition here in the French version, which I'm going to read for you today. So let's get into it. So I'm reading from chapter 43, How Alexander Made His Way to Consult the Trees of the Sun and the Moon. Alexander was amazed by this, wondering how two trees could talk. Let me go back maybe like a page before. Now in this, like a few paragraphs before, because they kind of lead into it. Now in this beautiful tract of land, the weather was fine and very hot, and it so happened that a number of men from the army went to wash and bathe in the stream from the spring. And our history says that among them are some who are very old, but the moment they washed and bathed in the water, they were restored to perfect bodily health and seemed no older than 30. Seeing this, everyone in the army suffering from sickness or infirmity or age came and bathed there, and even those who weren't unwell and didn't need a wash, in fact, everyone, until the whole army was so newly filled with health that there wasn't a slight trace of illness to be found. According to our history, this spring came from the earthly paradise that lay between the two rivers called the Tigris and the Euphrates. When Alexander and his followers, men and women alike, were thoroughly refreshed, he summoned the old men who were accompanying him and asked them if they knew of anything in those forests and deserts that they hadn't yet seen and was worth seeing. They replied that not far away was a marvel indeed, in the shape of two trees that gave answers to any questions. They were known as the trees of the sun and the moon. And then we go into chapter 43. Alexander was amazed by this, wondering how two trees could talk. But then it struck him that it might well be possible. He knew of many man-made idols in the world, of brass, for instance, and copper and wood, and other things that answered people's questions. So there was surely every reason to suppose that these trees, made by no less a being than the sovereign and eternal majesty, were far more likely to have such power. And so earnestly, wanting to know how his reign would end, he immediately gave orders to strike camp, for he wanted to press on. But you may be sure that many of his army were most reluctant. They would gladly have stayed there, in that land of so much bounty, but in obedience to the king's command they had to go, and after striking camp they all set off. They kept marching till they came upon a colossal mountain known by the people as a Mount Damastes. Steps led up the mountainside. Without them, it would have been unscalable. And as they drew closer, they noticed there was a huge golden chain that ran down the length of the steps to the mountain's foot, evidently placed there to provide a grip and support to the climber. According to Vincent's history, there were 3,500 steps, every one made of precious sapphires. Alexander, seeing the mountain's size, didn't want his army taxed by such a climb, and ordered them to make camp and pitch their tents. This was done. Then, when they were encamped, Alexander gathered a handful of his barons, those closest to him, and told them he meant to climb the mountain where the old men had told him there were two trees that answered people's questions. Only those of us here, he said, will go and explore the mountain top, so that if we find it's true about the trees, our men can't get in the way of our discovering that what adventures and events God has in store for us. So saying, Alexander began the climb, and his barons with him, but only the three, it seems. They kept climbing until they came upon a magnificent palace with doors and windows of fine gold. It was called the Palace of the Sun, and close beside it stood a temple wholly built of gold, with a golden vine outside its doors, bearing great fat bunches of pearls and onyx, ravishing to behold. As Alexander gazed at the Beatius buildings, he decided to enter the palace first. In he went, and the moment he entered, he saw a man lying in a gorgeous bed made of all gold, made of gold and covered with rich golden cloth. The man was very big of build, and his hair and beard were white. And lying in bed though he was dressed in a robe purest white, most fine and splendid, and according to our source, he lived solely on incense and balm. When they saw him, Alexander and his barons went down on their knees and worshipped him as if he were God, and a divine being he seemed indeed. And when the old man became aware of them, he said, "Have you come here, friends, to see the sacred tree of the sun and the moon, which forewarns us of what is to come?" And Alexander, suffused with joy, replied, "That is indeed why we have come, sir, truly, and we would be very glad to see them if you approve." Then the worthy man said, "If you and your princes are born of male and female, it is right that you should enter this place." And Alexander answered, "We are born of male and female." And the old man rose from the bed where he lay and said to them, "Come then, sirs, you must remove your clothes and shoes." So they began to undress, and when they were done, he said, "Follow me." And they set off after the old man, Alexander at the front, and Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Perdiccas behind, and followed him. He said that he led them into a forest enclosed by a mighty wall. Here they found trees akin to laurels and olive trees, but they soared to more than 100 feet and yielded abundant balm and incense. Deeper into the forest they went, and came upon a tree of astonishing height, devoid of leaves and fruit, on which sat an enormous bird with a crest on its head like a peacock, and feathers on its neck that shone like fine gold. The rest of its plumage was purple or rose. When Alexander and his barons caught sight of it, they asked the old man to tell them the name of the bird in the tree. And he said, "That bird is called the phoenix, and it's the only one in the world. But don't imagine it's immortal. No, it dies. But as soon as it does, so another is reborn from it by the Creator's will. And I'll tell you how. When the bird has run its natural course, it gathers a bundle of dry twigs on a high mountain in Arabia, and beats its wings to fan the sun's heat on the wood till it catches fire. And there, upon the pyre it's built, it destroys itself in the flames. But the day after the bird has burnt, an egg appears in the ashes and stays there throughout the second day. And on the third day the egg cracks open, and another phoenix emerges, which takes to the air that very day and flies here to this place, where it lives on what it finds in these lofty trees." Chapter 44. How, according to the history, Alexander spoke to the trees of the sun and the moon. After hearing the worthy man's story of the bird, they went deeper still into the forest, until they neared the trees. They sought and could clearly see them. Then the old man stopped and said, "There are the sacred trees, my friends. Approach them in all humility and look upward, and make sure you do not say a word. Then, once you have worshipped them and kissed them, ask your question inwardly, but do not utter it aloud. The tree of the sun will answer first in the Indian tongue, and then the tree of the moon will speak. Go now and do what you must." So Alexander went forward on his own and walked up to the trees, worshipped and kissed them in all humility. Then he began to pose the questions in his mind, whether he would conquer the whole world, and if he would ever return to his homeland of Macedon. His thought was answered by the trees, the tree of the sun first saying, "Alexander, you will indeed be the lord of all the earth, but you will never see the land of Macedon again, for as soon as you have achieved your conquest, you will pass from this world." With that the tree fell silent, and the tree of the moon spoke then, saying, "Alexander, you are nearing the end of your life, and you will be parted from this world by one you least suspect." Then Alexander began inwardly to say, "Most sacred tree, who is he who will part me from this world?" And the tree of the sun replied, "If you knew that, you would kill him, and your destiny would not be fulfilled." And the tree of the moon said, "No man needs to know the hour or the manner of his death. He would never be happy from that time forth, and it would be much to the displeasure of the three goddesses of destiny, the three sisters Cloto, Lachesis, and Anthropos. If we obstructed that, what they'd planned and ordained for mortal lives, but I'll tell you this much, your death won't be from blade or spearhead, as you may imagine, but from poison, and suddenly and soon. Then the worthy man came up and said, Alexander, my friend, that's enough. Don't press the trees any further, or it would make trouble for you. I'd advise you to go back now. Alexander said he was ready, though he was much dismayed by the news that his death was so near. They returned the way they'd come, and when they reached the palace of the sun, the worthy man gave them leave and disappeared inside. Alexander and his companions made their way back down the steps to rejoin the army at the mountain's foot, where they were received with jubilation. But it wasn't long, the history says, before the word of what the trees had said about Alexander's death had spread like wildfire. The army and everyone was talking of it. That's why our untitled source refers at this point to the death of Porus, suggesting that when Porus learned that the king hadn't long to live, he challenged him anew, thinking it was his prowess that was destined to bring Alexander to his death. But this interpretation was very wide of the mark, for Alexander paid to him as you've heard above. So we'll leave that now and return to our story. End of chapter 44. So this is the part where I might give some commentary, and I want to go into actually the Armenian version, which is basically a preserved form of the original or early version of the Alexander romance, because I still have some time. Now, I want to say this right now. I've read the Armenian version. I have not read this version. This is a lot more fleshed out. It's actually, I would say, more interesting in certain regards, but it is very different. There's a lot more language about, talking about sapphires and phoenixes and, this sort of man they don't speak of to whom he is and that kind of thing. It's very different. Let me go read the little notes that they gave for this as well. I think it's relevant. They have one note here that says, Wauquelin, which is the person who wrote it, the Frenchman, has now, I think it might have been from Burgundy, I'm not quite sure, has now returned to the following: the Prose Alexander, the French translation of the Historia de Pirelli, which he took to be the work of Vincent of Boivay. See note 1 above, page 135. And the other one right here, it says, there's no note right here. Okay. Is that all from there? No, that's, okay, so the first one here says literally from iron. Okay. And the other note that says here that's relevant says the verse Roman de Alexander, which was Wauquelin note above, page this is PP 202-3, deals differently with the end of the conflict between Porus and Alexander, does indeed digress at this point to recount at length the death of Porus. Okay. Now, I don't find that to be particularly relevant to what we're considering here about our particular episode. Now, I want to read the Armenian version for you, just because I find that to be particularly fascinating. Let me go find it if I can. The Alexander Romance. Here we go. This is the Armenian version of the Alexander Romance, which is a much better preserved version of the original one. So, basically, I'll read it because it actually just gives the whole game away, Okay, I think I have it right here. So, let me see. Tell us. Let me read this, okay. And this is basically when Alexander the Great conquers India, and he basically says, hey, what's so cool in India? And they give him an answer. So let's read it. And the Indians of their great own accord assembled together and said to me, Great king, you shall take cities and kingdoms and mountains and nations to which no living person has reached and attained, after as absolutely nothing exists worthy of your greatness. So basically they're saying, beyond India, there's nothing that exists. I can't think of anything that exists east of India, right? Nothing of relevance. I can't think of any countries east of India that are of any relevance to me, right? Tell us where, and all the men that there are in these little towns will come to you, and nowhere is more gold than there is here. And I praised them and approved, saying, because I have come upon many wonderful things in my travels, if you know of any fable or wonder worthy of a king's attention, point it out to me. And men came from the little towns and said, King, we have something wonderful that is worthy of showing you, for we shall show a plant that talks like man. And I immediately ordered that they be beaten for tricking me. But nevertheless, I thought it important to find out. And going on 12 days' journey from there, we came to a village which was said to be the end and southern boundary in the east. And beyond this there is nothing. They said, but beast-infested wilderness, where no one of us may go. And when we reached the place, they took us into a garden, for the village was covered not by stones or by bricks, but by trees, because of the sun and the moon. And in the middle of the park, as if for their protection, there was the sacrificial shrine to the sun and the moon. And there were 2 trees, both very similar, which were the same size as the cypress trees at home. And all about were the aforementioned trees, which are called myroballanos in Egypt, and the fruit too was similar. And they called upon the male for advice from men, and the female for women. And the name of the male was the sun, and the female the moon, which they call in their own language, Muthuam Avusa. And these trees were covered with the skin of various animals, and the male of the males and the female of the females. And they had neither iron, copper, tin, nor clay for making anything. And I asked, of what are these the hides? And they replied, of lions and leopards. And it was not allowed to have any tomb there, except that of the sun and the moon. And they used the hides of the animals as their garments. And I asked the questions to find out the reason for the animals, and they said, when it becomes light, as the hour the sun rises, a voice comes from those trees. Also, when the sun is in midday, in mid-sky, and again it is getting ready to set, these 3 times. And they said that the same is true about the moon. And they also said that as long as the sun moves and shines, they, the trees, give oracles. And when the moon appears, the same was true for it. And people who appeared to be priests came to me and said, enter with a pure heart and make reverence. And my friends, Parmenion, Crateron, Ulan, Machitis, Thrasilianta, Sacaona, and his companion Theodecton and Neocle, 10 men in all, were going in with me. And the priest said, King, it is not right to bring iron into the shrine. So I ordered my friends to leave their swords outside the enclave. And from the army 300 unarmed men came with me. I ordered all the men who were with me to look around and see, thus perhaps there be someone up on the trees. And they looked and searched and said there was no one. I called to me those Indians who had come with me that I might get a translation from them. I swear by Olympian, Aramaz, Ammon, Athena, all victory-giving gods, that I am not going to kill you. And simultaneously, with the setting of the sun, a voice in the barbarian Indian tongue came from the trees, and it was not translated for us. I summoned to me some Indians, but they refused to translate for me what the trees had said, for they were afraid of me and did not wish to reveal it. And I became concerned and laid hold of them and took them aside, and the Indians whispered in my ear, Know, King, that soon you are to be slain by your own men. When these heavenly signs were revealed and the moon was about to disappear in the east, those who were with me wanted to get another oracle at night. And having reflected upon my fate, I went within and asked entreatingly if I might return to my mother, Olympias, and to my good friends alive. And again, while my friends were there, when the moon rose, the tree made the same sound, saying approximately this in Greek. Alexander, you are to die in Babylon. You shall be slain by your own men, and you may not return to your mother, Olympias. And my friends and I were dumbfounded. I wanted to donate beautiful wreaths to the gods, but the priest said, It is not proper to do this, but, if you insist, do as you please, since there are no laws written for a king. And since I was very sad and vexed with matters, Parmenion and Philip beseeched me to sleep and to get ready for the morning. And since I did not care to do so, I rose in the morning with the rising of the sun, and with 10 friends again entered the temple, and I left them on one side, so that no one in the army would know my business. And in coming to the trees with the priest, I put my hand on the tree and asked, if the years of my life are finished, I wish to learn from you whether I shall return to Macedon and greet my mother and wife, Roxanne, and shall thus depart. And at the same time, as the sun rose and cast its light on the edge of the tree, a voice became sharp and clear and said, Alexander, the years of your life are ended, and you are not to have your wish of reaching your mother Olympias. Instead, you are to perish in Babylon, and are not to enter Macedon. The reason? You deprived many men of the sight of their mothers in cities and countries and friends. And just as one sows, so in fact shall he reap. And a little while later, your mother and your wife are to be cruelly slain by their own people, and your sister by your own family. And do not importune me about this, for you shall be heeded no more, even though you pleadingly petition me. Then I left there about the first hour, and when one day had come and gone in its way, I summoned all the troops and spoke to them together about their wishes. And traveling 15 days, I soon reached the city of Prasius, and they sent to me and sent to the neighboring cities to find out what strange things were being experienced from the things from the south. And so it goes on to talking about some other stuff that's going on in India that's not really relevant to what we're talking about here, which is about the sun and the moon, trees, and their prophecy of his impending death. So bear in mind, again, the Armenian tradition better preserves the earlier form of the Alexander Romance, and this French edition, obviously from the Middle Ages, is a much revised version of the tradition. So you can see that there's a lot of differences. The main motif is preserved. There's this tree. There's these two trees. They give a prophecy of his death, and they're associated with the sun, the moon, and male and female. Now, the male and the female thing is preserved in the French tradition. It doesn't have as much meaning to it because it's kind of like, okay, because you're born of male and female, therefore whatever, right? Therefore you can listen to the tree. There's also a different thing where they're talking, they preserve the ideas, they're speaking in the Indian language, but there's not as much emphasis necessarily on needing a translator, of course, in the French tradition. I like that aspect in the Armenian tradition, because it's sort of like you have this Indian guy. Alexander's asking, "Hey, what did it say? I don't speak the language," and he doesn't want to reveal it because he thinks he's going to get attacked or beaten or something like that. He's afraid of him, that kind of thing. So he doesn't want to tell him what's going on. It's kind of a funny little bit right there as well. I think the moral element that's presided in the Armenian tradition, where it's saying Alexander, you can ask why, but ultimately, you killed a ton of people. This is sort of like a divine comeuppance, I guess you could say, for all the cruelty that you bestowed upon the human race. I think that is probably an interesting dynamic. You reap what you sow, quite literally, in his situation. You brought death upon a number of many young men, and now you're going to have death brought upon yourself in your own youth, in your 30s, So I think that's a very interesting thing that's not really preserved in the French tradition. I've not read enough about the French version to understand whether or not they want to have a view of Alexander as being kind of a flawed person. That mentality of Alexander being fundamentally a flawed person with many issues is actually found in the earlier versions, which is interesting because you would think they'd be much more, because he was a pagan. He was a pagan who's founded the city of Alexandria, so you would think, they would actually be a lot more uncritical of him, which is not true. In the early Jewish traditions, you would find they were kind of critical of him. And over time, I guess they became more sympathetic. In the Islamic traditions of Durkanoin, they view him as basically being like a pious king, like Solomon, something like that, as being a really true believer, a true monotheist who was trying to spread the truth of monotheism across the world, which is simply not what was actually happened. He was a pagan, and one who thought of himself to be a son of the gods, the son of Amun-Ra or Amun-Zeus. So it's a little bit weird in that idea. I can't speak to the French tradition and to how much he really was viewed as being this pious and upright person. It seems to be that they do present him as believing in God, the Christian God, or the God of of the Israelites, the God of Abraham, that kind of thing, but also kind of being a pagan at the same time, doing both. He worships God, but he also kind of does this stuff that's basically pagan at the same time. He's kind of a halfway house between the two, which is interesting as well. So that's kind of how I view it. I like both traditions. I like both the French version here now that I've read it. I think it's interesting, the description of the sort of palace of gold and the gold sheets and this old man and the sapphire steps and this kind of thing and the phoenix and stuff. I think it's a very interesting dynamic, because even in the earlier version, they present the garden as being, some people present the garden as basically being like paradise, basically. He's going to paradise and he's meeting these two trees that are magical. And I think there's at least one situation, I believe, where they've conflated the two between the Garden of Eden and the paradise that he enters. Not in this version necessarily, but in at least one other characterization of the story of the garden that he goes into. So in this version, it actually kind of gives the same idea. It's saying, hey, listen, Alexander the Great is going into this garden, and there's like this beautiful plants, this beautiful palace. And there's this guy in the palace, and he's old, and it doesn't explain exactly what's going on with him in that situation. Is he like Enoch or Elijah or something? Like I don't know, right? But he's presented there, and it sounds like something you'd read in Orlando Furiosa with the palace of made out of a red cut stone, like a ruby or something like that. It sounds similar to that. But anyway, I think it's a very important episode in the Alexander Romance, because it's sort of like a turning point in a certain sense. The problem with the Alexander Romance is that it kind of just has a lot of different sections that are kind of smashed together and don't necessarily have a lot of overlap. This version of the Alexander Romance and the French version tries to kind of like sew them together so they're kind of chronological to some degree. So you can see how we're talking about the fountain of youth or immortality, or it has to be fountain of rejuvenation or something like that, and then leads into the story about the two trees. So they're trying to kind of stitch it together more effectively. But at the end of the day, it's not super chronological, but in as much as it is kind of chronological, this is an important turning point in Alexander's story, because not only is he going into India, which is his final conquest, but also he's being told, hey, listen, when you reach Babylon, you're going to die. And this sort of idea of your own invincibility, that's just not true. You're going to be betrayed by your own people. You're going to be betrayed by somebody close to you, and you're going to die like everybody else dies. So I think it's a very interesting moral angle given in this story, both and it's still true in the French tradition as well, but in a different way than the Armenian tradition. With the French tradition as well, the moral angle that they're giving is about, well, you don't really want to know the specifics of your death, because on one part, you're basically trying to cheat your own destiny, which is simply not something in the cards for you. That's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to accept your own, demise, the reality of your death. And the other situation is saying, like, if you really knew all the specifics about how you would die and when you would die and all the rest, you probably wouldn't be too happy about it. You'd probably be pretty bummed out about it, which is true. If you found out that you're going to, that's people who find out that they don't want to know if they have like some sort of predisposition towards some sort of disease, because they don't want to be constantly worried about it, that kind of thing. And then simply sometimes ignorance about a certain situation might be preferable to being a person who might be constantly worried about the fact that they are in fact going to die, and that their demise is not going to be a pretty one. So anyway, I really like that episode of the Alexander Romance. I think it's very interesting. I think it has an interesting moral angle to it as well. It's an early tradition. It's a very well-known one. And that's why I wanted to read it in the French version, because I think it is fleshed out, at least in a different way. They both actually have a lot of detail to them, but they are fleshed out in different ways. It's a different. It's a reimagination of the same concept. So if you like that reading, smash that like button, click subscribe, whatever they say. I might do more readings from this French Alexander Romance. I want to read some of the stuff about the Fountain of Rejuvenation and some of the marvelous monsters of the Orient that they talk about. I know in the earlier traditions they talk about like dog-headed men and men who have faces in their chests, and they have all sorts of goofy stuff like that. In this tradition, they have some of that stuff as well, but I think it's different kinds of monsters. They talk about giants and other sorts of weird stuff like that. So I might do a video on that as well at some point. But anyway, if you found this to be interesting, I hope you did. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, and goodbye.